They say that in the winter of 1936 the cold could silence a town. It was the kind of cold that made wooden doors groan like living things, the kind of cold that froze wagon wheels solid in place, the kind of cold that left even the strongest men quietly wondering whether nature itself had turned against them. And yet, hidden beneath that brutal season were stories almost no one tells anymore. Stories of small kindnesses, strange sightings in the frozen night, forgotten communities holding on with quiet strength, and moments of beauty so gentle they could make the worst winter feel almost sacred. Tonight, as you settle in and let your thoughts soften, we'll step back together into that winter, the coldest winter in US history. A winter that shaped the land, reshaped lives, and left behind memories that still linger in the silence of old American towns. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it right now? Your answers always make this place feel like a warm shared room. And if you enjoy winding down with true calming stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to Historical Truth so you can drift off with us again next time. Now, let your breathing slow, let your eyes grow heavy, and let's begin. By the early days of January 1936, the United States was already exhausted. The Great Depression had worn down families, farms, and entire towns. Food was scarce, jobs even scarcer, and hope, though not gone, was quieter than it used to be. But no one expected the cold that was coming. No one imagined that the winter of 36 would rewrite the record books. Across the northern plains, the first warnings came not from scientists, but from farmers who had learned to listen to the land. They noticed the way the wind shifted, sharp and insistent. They saw how the birds moved differently, low, fast, restless. They watched the way frost formed on branches earlier than usual, clinging like crystal webs long before winter had truly begun. People who lived close to nature felt the change immediately, even if they couldn't name it. In North Dakota, in a tiny town whose population never reached past a few hundred, an elderly man named Samuel Creighton stepped onto his porch one evening and quietly said to himself, "This will be the winter we remember." Samuel wasn't a man prone to dramatic statements. He preferred calm words and deliberate actions, and he had lived long enough to witness disasters of many kinds. Droughts, storms, illnesses, and summers so dry that even the rivers seemed to shrink away. But he felt something different this time. The air had a stillness that made him uneasy. By mid-January, the first blizzard swept across the Dakotas and Minnesota, rolling in like a moving wall of white. People who were outside said it looked as if the sky itself had collapsed. Snow didn't fall, it attacked. Winds screamed at nearly 60 miles an hour, and the temperature plummeted in a matter of hours. Even in towns used to harsh winters, this storm arrived like an intruder. Families huddled on the ground floors of their homes, letting stoves burn through the last of their coal reserves. The wind rattled windows until the glass trembled, its edges singing in a thin, vibrating hum. Babies cried at the sharpness of the cold. Elderly neighbours were checked on every few hours, not out of obligation, but out of genuine fear that the cold might claim them in the night. In the town of Pembina, near the Canadian border, the schoolteacher, a quiet woman named Margaret Shaw, kept her students indoors for an entire week. She taught them next to the iron stove, letting the children take turns warming their fingers by holding them close to the heat, without touching the metal. She told stories from her childhood, sang soft melodies, and did everything she could to keep their spirits gentle and calm, even though she herself felt a growing knot of unease. One morning she arrived at the schoolhouse to find frost inside the windows, delicate patterns spreading across the glass like silver feathers. But the storm did not stay in the north. It moved, slowly, deliberately, like something alive. By late January it swept eastward, wrapping Wisconsin, Iowa, and Illinois in a punishing freeze. Lakes that had never fully frozen before hardened into thick, pale mirrors. Rivers slowed to sluggish trickles beneath layers of ice. Train whistles carried strangely far in the brittle air, travelling miles across frozen fields. In the small village of Galena, Illinois, 12-year-old Thomas Reed would remember the cold for the rest of his life. Decades later, he described it as the winter the world turned blue. He remembered waking up each morning to a quiet so deep it felt almost holy. He remembered the way everyone's breath lingered in the air, not just as a small puff, but as long trails that floated and glowed in the moonlight like small ghosts drifting through the night. Despite the harshness, people learned to move through the cold as though moving through a dream. Horses were blanketed in thick layers of wool, lanterns became precious, glowing orbs of warmth carried from place to place, and yet, even with all their preparation, death walked the country that winter with a slow, steady patience. Livestock perished in barns that were simply too drafty to hold heat. Cars failed to start, telephone lines snapped under the weight of ice, and in some places the snow came so heavily that entire houses disappeared beneath drifts that rose to the rooftops. But hidden among the hardship were moments of deep humanity. In Minnesota, a group of neighbours walked through the storm every night to check on a blind man who lived near the edge of town. They didn't ask for recognition, they simply made it part of their routine. They brought him hot broth, chopped wood for his stove, and stayed long enough to make sure the room warmed. Their footprints in the snow, long steady trails, became a symbol of quiet compassion. In South Dakota, a family who owned a small bakery decided to give away bread for free every Sunday. They had little to spare themselves, but as the father said, "A warm loaf can save a person twice, once from hunger, once from fear." And in the frozen silence of that winter, thousands of small acts like these flickered like candles in the dark. As the cold tightened its grip across the United States, no one yet knew that February would bring temperatures so low they would break nearly every record on the books. No one knew the strange events, the breathtaking beauty, the tragedies, and the almost miraculous survival stories that would unfold before spring finally arrived. By the time February 1936 arrived, the United States felt like a nation suspended inside a block of ice. Each day blended quietly into the next, blue mornings, white afternoons, violet evenings. People kept track of time not by the sun, which was often buried behind clouds, but by the crack and pop of timber inside their stoves, the crunch of boots over snow, and the slow, rhythmic drip of melting frost from rooftops whenever a rare hour of sunlight managed to break through. It was during those early February days that the cold truly revealed its strength. In North Dakota, residents woke to hear neighbours shouting across yards, voices carried unusually far in the dense frozen air. Thermometers had plunged to 60°, and in some towns, mercury froze solid inside the glass tubes, shrinking into small metallic beads at the bottom. Even the oldest residents, men and women in their 80s, shook their heads and whispered that they had never seen anything like this. And yet, despite the shocking temperatures, life had to continue. In the town of Fargo, the postmaster, Ernest Willoughby, refused to suspend daily mail delivery. He bundled himself in layer upon layer, wool shirt, cotton undershirt, heavy jacket, buffalo-lined coat, 2 scarves, thick mittens, and stepped into the wind each morning as though walking into battle. Icicles formed on his eyelashes before he reached the first house, and his breath froze instantly into small white crystals on his moustache. Children would watch from windows, cheeks pressed to the cold glass, excited to see him appear like a determined silhouette trudging through the storm. Ernest later said he kept delivering letters because, during the coldest winter in living memory, people needed reminders of the world beyond the snow, reminders that someone cared enough to write. In other regions, however, the cold pushed towns to their limits. In Minneapolis, streetcars stalled so frequently that entire routes were abandoned for days. Station attendants had to build small fires beneath the engines just to warm the mechanisms enough to function. The steel tracks themselves creaked and groaned, contracting with every drop in temperature until they warped, bending slightly like softened wax. Workers hammered at the frozen metal, sparks flying into the night like fireflies trapped in the wrong season. Still, despite these enormous challenges, communities continued to find ways to adapt. In Wisconsin, a group of volunteers turned the town hall into a warming shelter. Families brought blankets, soup pots, coffee tins, and lanterns. They spread straw on the wooden floor to keep children warm and placed stoves at each corner of the room. At night, the glow of those 4 stoves illuminated the faces of people sleeping in small clusters. Neighbours, who had barely spoken to one another during ordinary times, now resting shoulder to shoulder like an extended family. The mayor, a gentleman named Harold Benton, visited the shelter every evening. He would walk slowly through the room, whispering to newcomers, making sure everyone had something to eat. Later in life, he would say this winter taught him that leadership wasn't about speeches or titles. It was about noticing who was cold and doing something about it. Meanwhile, strange stories began circulating across the Midwest, stories that, even decades later, remained part of local folklore. One of the most whispered tales came from northern Minnesota, where a farmer named Eli Turner claimed to have seen lights dancing across the sky one night, brighter than any aurora he had ever witnessed. He described them as long, shimmering curtains of blue and green that rippled like living things. The lights stretched from horizon to horizon, flickering silently. Eli said he stood there for almost an hour, feeling as though the sky itself were trying to speak. Scientists later suggested the lights were a rare geomagnetic display intensified by atmospheric conditions during the extreme cold. But to the people who saw them, it felt like a moment of beauty sent specifically to break the monotony of the brutal winter. Another story came from the outskirts of Helena, Montana, where a woman named Clara Whitmore found a fox standing motionless outside her barn one dawn, its fur coated in frost so thick it looked silver. The animal didn't flee when she approached. Instead, it slowly stepped aside to reveal its kits, two tiny pups shivering in the snow, barely alive. Clara, who already struggled to feed her own family, didn't hesitate. She carried the pups inside her home, warmed them by the fire and fed them scraps. In return, the mother fox lingered near the barn for weeks, leaving tiny tracks in the snow each morning as though watching over the woman who had saved her young. But winter was not all small miracles and shimmering skies. There were darker moments too, moments that tested families in ways they had never experienced. In South Dakota, a train became stuck in a drift so tall it rose higher than the locomotive itself. Passengers were stranded for nearly 2 days before help arrived. They burned seat cushions to stay warm, shared food from their suitcases, and sang hymns to keep their spirits steady through the nights. One elderly woman later wrote that the sound of voices singing inside that frozen train was the most comforting thing I had ever heard. In Iowa, a farming community near the town of Boone experienced one of the harshest nights of the entire season. Livestock barns collapsed under the weight of ice, fences snapped, and nearly all the wells froze solid. Neighbors spent hours digging paths through the drifts to reach each other. By morning, they had created a network of tunnels, narrow corridors carved through snow taller than a grown man. Photographs taken later showed people walking through these ice canyons, their silhouettes dwarfed by the massive white walls stretching around them. Yet even then, even in the harshest conditions, people held on to one another. In Ohio, a young couple expecting their first child faced the terrifying possibility of delivering the baby alone when their road froze shut. But when the contractions began, a dozen neighbors formed a human chain, holding lanterns and walking together through the knee-high snow to bring a doctor to the farmhouse. The baby girl was born just after sunrise, wrapped in quilts and welcomed into a world that, despite its coldness, was filled with warmth of another kind. Throughout February, the temperatures continued to drop. Record after record fell. Wisconsin, Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Iowa, all reaching levels so low that newspapers across the country wrote headlines in bold, astonished type. Radios hissed with weather reports that barely seemed believable, and still the cold deepened. Still, the country waited. The harshest days were yet to come. By mid-February 1936, the cold had ceased to feel like weather. It felt instead like a presence, an immense, silent force pressing steadily across the United States, rearranging lives, routines, and even the rhythm of everyday thoughts. Towns that were normally loud with the sounds of engines, laughter, and hammering now found themselves wrapped in a soft, eerie quiet. Snow absorbed every sound, and the cold held it there, as though the world had been gently muted. People moved more slowly. Speech was shorter. Every decision, from stepping outside to fetching water, was made with the knowledge that the cold was waiting. And yet, life went on. In northern Wisconsin, a lumber mill shut down after the gears inside its great saws cracked from the extreme temperatures. Workers, suddenly without their daily routine, gathered inside the owner's house, a grand old structure with thick brick walls and a wide stone fireplace. The owner, Mr. Enoch Rutherford, was a stern man with a rigid spine and a reputation for expecting perfection from his workers. But during that winter, something softened in him. Perhaps it was the way his house filled each night with men playing cards near the fire, or the constant swirl of steam rising from mugs of hot coffee. Perhaps it was the way the workers told stories, long-forgotten tales from childhood, just to pass the cold hours. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, Enoch surprised everyone by pulling out a fiddle he kept hidden in an upstairs wardrobe. The workers erupted in laughter, insisting they needed proof the instrument could even be played by someone as serious as Enoch. But to their astonishment, he played beautifully, a slow, aching tune that reminded them of warm summers, running streams, and days when the earth wasn't sealed in ice. That night, for the first time in weeks, the men forgot the cold. They sat quietly, listening to the song echo in the rafters, and some even admitted they had tears forming in the corners of their eyes. The coldest winter had a strange way of revealing the private corners of people's hearts. Across the river in Minnesota, a young woman named Helen Price kept a diary that would later become one of the most detailed personal records of the winter. She wrote by lamplight, the flame trembling with each gust of wind. One entry read, "Everything creaks. The walls, the stairs, even the trees outside. They sound like they're tired of holding themselves together. Mother says the cold is trying to get in, and I believe her. It feels like something pressing against the house, searching every crack." But Helen didn't only record fear, she captured the beauty too. Tonight the snow fell straight down, like feathers being dropped from a white sky. It was the quietest snowfall I've ever seen. Father and I stood at the door for almost an hour, saying nothing, as though we didn't want to disturb it. In the Midwest, people found creative ways to adapt. Kitchens became the warm heart of every home. Families spent most of their waking hours there, reading, sewing, talking, simply existing near the stove. Food was stretched in clever ways. Soups made from leftover vegetables, biscuits baked in batches to store for days, potatoes roasted until the skins crisped and steamed when broken open. On farms, animals huddled together in barns that rattled under the weight of the wind. The cold sank deep into the earth, nearly 4 feet in some places, freezing soil that had never frozen before. Farmers struggled to break the crust of snow that formed each night as hard as stone. But even in such harshness, nature found small ways to endure. Deer began gathering near railroad tracks, drawn by the scattered kernels of spilled grain. Birds, refusing to migrate further south, perched in sheltered corners of houses, their tiny bodies puffed up like brown and grey cotton balls. Some children even began leaving crumbs on windowsills, delighted when the birds returned each morning, tapping gently on the glass with their beaks. But the winter wasn't finished showing its strength. Around February 15th, a massive cold wave, later called the Arctic Surge, rolled down from Canada with a force no one had anticipated. Temperatures dropped again, shattering even the records set earlier that month. In several towns, readings fell so low the ink inside weather instruments thickened, making the numbers difficult to trace. In Montana, the railroad company struggled to keep trains running. Snowplows pushed drifts taller than the engines themselves, sparks snapping against the frozen rails. Engineers wrapped thick blankets around the boilers to trap every possible bit of heat. Despite their efforts, dozens of locomotives failed. In one remarkable case, a stranded train near the town of Chester was found by a group of ranchers who had been searching for missing cattle. They recognized the danger immediately. With temperatures near 50 degrees Celsius, the passengers wouldn't survive long. The ranchers rode back to town, rounded up every horse-drawn sleigh they could find, and returned in force. Wrapped in buffalo robes and wool blankets, they helped evacuate more than 30 passengers, guiding them through the swirling snow to safety. Newspapers later called them heroes. The ranchers shrugged and said, it was just the right thing to do. In small towns, pastors opened churches for warmth. The sound of hymns drifted across frozen streets, soft, wavering notes that carried far in the clear, brittle air. Even those who rarely attended services found themselves drawn to the glow of stained glass windows lit from within. Churches smelled of wool coats drying by the radiators and the faint scent of burning candles. Meanwhile, in Pennsylvania and Ohio, rivers began freezing in strange, uneven ways. Massive ice sheets collided, stacking on top of one another like the broken plates of a shattered dinner table. Some of these stacks rose several feet high, Children were warned not to climb them, but every so often a brave or reckless youngster would scramble up a ridge of ice just to see the land from a new angle. Electricity, still unreliable in many rural areas, became a luxury. Lines snapped under the weight of ice, leaving entire communities in darkness. Families lit oil lamps which flickered against the frosted windows, casting golden halos on the snow outside. Even today, elderly Americans who lived through 1936 describe the memory of those nights, the sense of moving through a world illuminated not by switches and wires, but by small flames and human togetherness. Despite all this, an unspoken question lingered in every household. How long could the cold last? No one could answer. No one had ever seen anything like it. And the deepest cold, the most unforgettable chapter, was still approaching. As February reached its final week, an odd stillness settled over much of the United States. It wasn't peace, no one would call it that, but it was a kind of pause, as though even the wind had grown weary of carrying snow from one side of the plains to the other. People stepped outside and noticed it immediately. The air felt heavier, denser, like breathing through a thick layer of cotton. Dogs barked less. Horses twitched their ears uneasily. Even the ever-restless crows seemed subdued, perched silently along fence posts with their feathers puffed out against the cold. Across the country, meteorologists studied their instruments with a growing sense of disbelief. Readings were dropping to levels unseen in modern American history, plunging far below what their charts considered extreme. Many weather stations recorded temperatures beyond the lower limits of their equipment. When a thermometer's mercury retreated into the bulb and lodged there like frozen silver, observers could only shake their heads and write notes by hand. Likely colder than 55 Celsius, exact temperature unknown. And then, as if the winter were delivering its final statement, the cold deepened once more. In the tiny community of Langdon, North Dakota, already burdened with some of the coldest temperatures, residents woke on February 15th to a morning that would become legend. The sky glowed a pale violet before sunrise, hinting at a day that should have been beautiful. But the moment someone stepped outside, the truth struck them like a blow. It was colder than any living person had ever felt. An elderly trapper named Alden Witt, who had spent most of his life along the Canadian border, opened his front door and felt his breath freeze inside his beard. He tried to speak but found his jaw stiffened almost instantly. Later, he would describe the sensation as like the cold grabbed hold of my bones. That day, Langdon recorded one of the lowest temperatures in the nation's history, 60 degrees. At such temperatures, strange things happened. Boiling water thrown into the air turned immediately into a cloud of ice crystals, sparkling like shattered diamonds. Axes bounced off frozen wood instead of cutting through it. Spilled gasoline gelled into thick syrup. Milk delivered to doorsteps froze solid inside the glass bottles, pushing the cardboard tops upward like miniature snow-capped mountains. And yet, life continued. The local doctor, a calm, steady man named Dr. Ellis Warren, made house calls long after common sense suggested he should stay indoors. He wrapped heated bricks in wool blankets and placed them at the bottom of his sleigh to keep his feet warm. He visited homes where stoves had failed, where infants needed treatment for frostbitten fingers, and where elderly neighbours lay bundled under mountains of quilts, praying for warmth. Dr. Warren never charged for visits during February. A bill can wait, he said. A heartbeat can't. In his diary, which historians discovered decades later, he wrote, "Tonight the sky is clear. The stars look close enough to touch, close enough to warm, but the cold between us is unfathomable. The cold is its own kind of night." Meanwhile, in Minnesota, the cold brought not only hardship, but strange sights that people would remember for the rest of their lives. One evening, as temperatures hovered near 50 degrees, a phenomenon known today as light pillars appeared over the town of Bemidji. Dozens of vertical beams, tall, glowing columns, rose from street lamps, headlights, and porch lanterns, stretching straight upward into the sky. To residents, it looked as though shimmering towers of light were being built above the town. Children pressed their faces to frosty windows, whispering that angels were descending. Men and women stood outside in disbelief, breath freezing in the air as they watched the pillars sway gently, like celestial ladders anchored to the earth. For 20 minutes, it felt as though the heavens had lowered themselves to greet humanity during its coldest hour. Later, scientists would explain the event. Tiny ice crystals suspended in the air had reflected the light in perfect alignment. But for the people who saw it that night, the scientific explanation never replaced the memory of awe. Across the Dakotas, farmers faced an entirely different threat. The deep freeze was killing off the wheat and rye that many families depended on for survival. Roads were clogged with drifts, some the height of farmhouses, making travel nearly impossible. Trains that normally delivered coal, flour, and dried goods were delayed for days or even weeks. In one small county, residents organized what they called the caravan. With horses, sleds, and raw determination, they carved a path through the snow to reach a stalled train 20 miles away. The journey took 2 days. When they returned, the sleds were loaded with sacks of flour, canned goods, and mail that had piled up in the conductor's car. As the caravan re-entered town, people lined the roads, waving from their doorsteps with tears in their eyes. There were no cheers, voices didn't carry well in the cold, but a quiet reverence spread across the crowd, an unspoken acknowledgement that even the harshest winter couldn't break their bond. Farther east, in Ohio and Pennsylvania, the cold created a different kind of danger. Ice began forming dams along major rivers, blocking the natural flow of water. As more ice accumulated, the pressure built silently beneath the frozen surface. Some residents nervously joked that the rivers sounded restless at night, as though shifting in their sleep. Then, on one unforgettable morning, the Ohio River shattered. People living near the banks described hearing a sound like thunder, a single, enormous crack that rolled across the countryside. The ice broke into massive jagged slabs, some the size of small cars, which ground against each other as the river surged forward. Homes built too close to the banks trembled. Dock posts snapped. Wooden boats were crushed as though made of paper. Yet even this destruction carried a strange, haunting beauty. Witnesses said the broken ice gleamed in the sunlight like a field of crystals drifting toward the sea. For many, that moment became the symbol of February, 1936, nature breaking itself apart under the weight of its own winter. Everywhere the question lingered, when will this end? Even the most seasoned meteorologists had no answer. Radio broadcasts encouraged people to stay indoors. Newspapers printed survival tips next to stories of record-breaking lows, frozen towns, and improbable acts of generosity. In living rooms across America, families sat close to stoves, listening as radio announcers read temperatures in solemn tones. -48 in Fargo, -53 in International Falls, -45 in Bismarck, -60 reported near the border. Each reading felt like another step into a world that no longer resembled the America people knew. But even in that world of frost and silence, the human spirit refused to freeze. And the true turning point, the moment when the coldest winter began to shift, was still ahead. As the nation entered the final days of February 1936, a sense of collective exhaustion settled over millions of Americans. They were tired, not only in body, but in spirit. Weeks of relentless cold had seeped into every part of life. It stiffened clothing, slowed movements, squeezed through the smallest cracks in walls, and whispered through the streets at night. The cold was everywhere, and there was no escaping it, not even in sleep, where dreams often carried echoes of howling wind and rattling windows. Yet even in this fatigue, there was something else rising quietly beneath the surface: endurance. Human beings, it seemed, were far more resilient than the winter expected. In the northern plains, where temperatures were still plunging toward historic lows, families began creating rituals to keep their minds steady. Some read aloud every night by the stove, choosing the thickest books they owned and taking turns until their voices weakened. Others carved small wooden toys, painted with whatever scraps of colour remained in old tins. Children played board games on floors layered with blankets to keep out the chill. One mother in Fargo taught her children how to make snow lanterns, small towers built by packing snow into blocks and stacking them in a circle with a candle inside. When lit at dusk, the lanterns glowed warmly, casting golden halos across the yard. She told her children that each lantern was a promise that winter would eventually break. Neighbours began setting their own lanterns outside, until whole streets looked as though they were lined with tiny glowing fortresses of hope. In the mountains of Montana, a remote mining cabin became the unlikely refuge of 3 travelers: a schoolteacher, a railroad inspector, and a young salesman named Arthur Kellen. Caught by a sudden whiteout on the road between towns, they had taken shelter in the abandoned structure. What was meant to be a brief rest turned into a 3-day ordeal, as snow piled against the door and sealed them inside. The cabin had a small stove, half a sack of potatoes, and exactly 7 matches. For 3 nights they rationed the matches with almost ceremonial care. 1 match per meal, 1 for warmth in the morning, 1 held in reserve in case the stove went out unexpectedly. They shared stories about their families, their dreams, and the strange twists of fate that had led them to that frozen mountain. On the 3rd day, a group of ranchers found them, after noticing the faint curl of smoke rising from the chimney. When the rescuers opened the door, sunlight flooded the cabin and the 3 travelers stepped into the fresh air, with tears streaming down their faces, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming relief of seeing the world beyond the walls again. Years later, the salesman, Arthur, would insist that the experience changed him forever. "I learned," he wrote, "that a single match can be worth more than gold, and a single voice in the dark can save you from losing yourself." Meanwhile, in the Great Lakes region, the cold created phenomena rarely seen before or since. Along Lake Superior, enormous ice ridges formed, great jagged mounds that rose as high as 20 feet. When the wind blew across them, they emitted low, resonant tones that echoed across the water like distant singing. Fishermen called it the winter choir, a natural symphony produced by shifting pressure and fractured ice. One evening, an Ojibwe elder brought his grandchildren to the shoreline to listen. Wrapped in furs, they sat together as the strange, beautiful sound droned across the frozen lake. The elder told them stories of how their ancestors believed the ice spoke with the voices of the spirits, voices reminding people of their place within the natural world. The children listened in reverent silence. Even decades later, they would remember that night as one of the most peaceful moments of their lives. Elsewhere, the cold forged unexpected bonds between strangers. In Ohio, a man named James Carver noticed his neighbor's chimney had stopped smoking one morning. Knowing this was unusual, he trudged through knee-deep snow to check on the elderly widow who lived there. He found her nearly unconscious from the cold, her stove extinguished after the last of her woodpile had been used up during the night. Without hesitation, James carried her to his own home, wrapped in blankets, and settled her near his fire. He then spent the afternoon chopping wood until his hands blistered, ensuring she would have enough fuel for the coming week. When asked later why he worked so hard for someone he barely knew, he simply replied, "No winter is colder than a life lived alone." Stories like this spread across thousands of towns, quiet acts of heroism performed not for recognition, but because the season demanded it. Yet for all the compassion and resilience on display, the winter still tightened its grip. In the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, a mining company shut down its operations entirely. Tunnels deep underground froze solid, something old miners said they had never seen. Even the ore carts, heavy as they were, became stuck in place when their wheels fused to the tracks. The shutdown left hundreds of workers unsure of their next paycheck, but instead of panic, the community adapted. Families pooled resources: canned food, dried meat, quilts, coal. The local church organized a communal kitchen, and every evening miners and their families gathered for hot meals prepared by volunteers. Conversations were slow but warm. Children played near the glowing kerosene lamps. Laughter returned in small, cautious bursts. And then, something curious happened. In late February, as if nature itself had grown weary of its own severity, people began noticing tiny changes, barely perceptible, but unmistakable to anyone who'd lived through the last brutal weeks. The air, while still cold, didn't sting the lungs quite as sharply. Frost clung to windows in thinner patterns. Snow felt just a touch softer beneath heavy boots. The weather reports echoed this shift. Radio announcers read the forecast with a hint of disbelief. Temperatures rising, slight thaw expected, highs approaching 0. 0. A number that once meant nothing now sounded like salvation. People didn't celebrate, not yet. They had seen the cold return too many times to trust a single forecast. But there was a subtle lightening across the nation, a loosening in shoulders, a softening in eyes, a faint but undeniable sense that the winter's peak might finally be passing. Still, the story of 1936 wasn't finished, because as the cold slowly began to lift, a new threat stirred on the horizon, one born not of ice, but of the thaw that would eventually follow. The next chapter of the coldest winter would bring floods, destruction, and a test of endurance that seemed almost unfair after weeks of suffering. But that part of the tale comes next. The coldest winter of 1936 crept deeper into the nation with a strange kind of quiet persistence. In towns across Minnesota, Iowa, and the Dakotas, life slowed to a rhythm dictated entirely by the temperature. Mornings began before the sun rose, not because people wanted an early start, but because sleep became lighter in such cold, and waking felt more natural than staying curled beneath heavy quilts. By early January, entire communities were measuring their days not by hours but by kerosene levels, by how much wood remained in the shed, or by how thick the frost grew on the inside of their windows. Mail carriers broke routes into shorter segments, stopping often to warm their hands against small heating bricks wrapped in cloth. Children still walked to school when it wasn't closed, though bundled almost comically. Scarves layered upon scarves, mittens over gloves, caps pulled so low they could barely see. Their laughter, when it came, sounded strangely bright in the frozen air, as though the cold sharpened the sound itself. In the tiny town of Morris, Minnesota, residents began to talk about the cold as if it were a living being. They gave it personality, intent, a stubborn will. "She's settling in for the long haul," one elderly farmer said, nodding toward the horizon as if addressing the winter directly. And people believed him. The cold felt aware, heavy, and strangely watchful. On the outskirts of town lived the Ramsey family, quiet people, known mostly for their resilience and their small dairy farm. The father, Thomas, had a calm way about him, the sort of man who seldom raised his voice or lost his temper, no matter how much the world around him froze or cracked. His wife, Eleanor, was the heart of the home, with a warmth so steady that neighbours often said her presence alone could thaw a kitchen. Their two children, Henry and little Alice, were used to harsh winters, but even they sensed something different this year. At night they huddled near the cast-iron stove, listening to the eerie groaning of the house. The boards contracted so deeply in the cold that it sounded almost like someone walking slowly in the walls. Sometimes, just before sleep, Henry swore he heard distant echoes, perhaps the settling of ice along the river, or perhaps the wind slipping between the barn walls. To a boy of 10, though, the unknown had a sound all its own. Still, the Ramsey home was a refuge. Many evenings, travellers passing through town would spot the glow of their farmhouse window and ask to warm themselves inside. The Ramseys never turned anyone away. Hot broth was always offered. Flannel blankets were always brought out. It was an unspoken rule of rural life. In times this cold, kindness wasn't optional, it was survival, but even kindness had limits. In the second week of January, when temperatures dropped to 50 degrees in some parts of the Midwest, a strange phenomenon began to occur. It started with the river. Locals noticed that portions of the water had frozen so quickly and violently that it trapped air beneath the surface, creating pockets that echoed like drums when tapped. Children found it amusing. Grown men found it unsettling. Then came the reports from the rail stations. Freight cars arrived so cold that metal doors fused shut. Workers had to heat the locks with small torches just to open them. In several cases, entire engines froze mid-journey, stalled on tracks in the middle of nowhere. Passengers waited silently as blankets were distributed, and conductors walked from car to car checking for signs of frostbite. By the third week, the newspapers had stopped trying to soften the headlines. Coldest winter in US history. No end in sight. Temperatures break records across Midwest governors call for federal aid. Yet beneath the bold black letters, there was something else, a quiet sense of awe, a recognition that nature itself had assumed control, reminding people how small they truly were against the forces of the earth. One evening, just as the sky began to dim, Thomas Ramsey noticed something unusual along the tree line near the road. At first, it appeared as smoke, but the air was still, and no chimneys nearby were active. As he stepped closer, he realized it was not smoke at all, but frost lifting from the branches as the last rays of daylight brushed them. The sight was strangely beautiful, almost mystical. Each plume of frost shimmered like silver dust, drifting upward and dissolving into the pale blue air. Moments like that gave the winter an almost ethereal quality. Harsh, yes, but also breathtaking in its stillness. Inside the farmhouse, Eleanor lit a lantern as the children gathered around the table. The wind outside whispered along the eaves. Snow shifted lightly against the windows. There was no urgency in their movements, no rush for bedtime. Winter, after all, had slowed everything down. Eleanor read aloud from a small collection of historical tales, stories of early settlers who faced storms far worse, of communities that banded together through blizzards and famine. Her voice was steady and warm, perfectly suited for the tender quiet of the night. The children leaned closer, their eyes heavy but comforted by the rhythm of her words. When the lantern dimmed and the fire softened, the family settled into their beds, layers of quilts tucked up to their chins. Outside, the cold deepened, sculpting delicate crystals along the edges of the window panes. And through it all, the winter pressed on, silent, relentless, but filled with countless small stories of endurance, of hope, and of the extraordinary beauty found only in the harshest seasons. By the final days of January 1936, the cold was no longer simply a season. It had become a presence that shaped every minute of the day. In towns across the Midwest, people spoke less, moved slower, and listened more carefully to the creaks of their homes and the murmurs of the icy wind. Even the animals sensed the unusual weight of the winter. Cows huddled together for warmth, their breaths rising in clouds that froze almost instantly. Horses stood closer to barn walls, their bodies absorbing what little heat remained trapped in the wood. In the town of Morris, the streets were lined with tall white banks of snow that resembled miniature cliffs. Snowplows struggled to keep routes open for more than a few hours. The drifts were so deep that in some neighbourhoods, people dug tunnels from their front doors to the main road. Children, when allowed outside, moved like little bundled shadows, their laughter carried away by the steady northern wind. At the Ramsey farm, the rhythms of daily life had settled into a pattern of endurance. Every morning before dawn, Thomas stepped out to check on the livestock. The sound of his boots crunching against the ice echoed faintly across the fields. He moved with deliberate care, knowing that frostbite could set in within minutes at these temperatures. Inside the barn, breath from the cows rose, like steam against the rafters. Despite the bitter cold, the animals welcomed him with gentle grunts and nudges, trusting him to keep them safe through the long winter. Back in the house, Eleanor simmered a pot of thin stew over the stove, its warmth filling the kitchen with a comforting aroma. Little Alice sat at the table wrapped in a thick wool blanket, drawing shapes into the frost on the window with her finger. "It's like painting on glass," she whispered, mesmerised by the way the icy patterns shifted under her touch. Henry, ever curious, had taken to keeping a small notebook of daily observations. Temperature changes, wind direction, snowfall height. He didn't fully understand the science behind it, but he felt instinctively that this winter was something people would talk about for generations. Writing it down made him feel like a witness to history. But beyond the farm, the cold was beginning to take a deeper toll. In neighbouring towns, stories emerged of supply trains delayed for days because entire rail lines had frozen solid. Grocery shelves thinned, prices rose, parents rationed food more carefully, stretching what little they had into simple meals meant only to warm the stomach. Some families burned furniture to keep their homes from dropping to dangerous temperatures. Churches opened their doors as warming centres, offering cots and hot drinks for those living in drafty homes. Within their walls, strangers sat together in quiet companionship. Conversations were soft, reflective, punctuated by the occasional murmur of gratitude for even the smallest comforts. A warm mug, a shared blanket, a kind word spoken aloud. The county doctor, Dr. Merrick, made house calls almost daily. Riding in a horse-drawn sleigh lined with hay, he travelled from home to home, checking on the elderly, the sick, and the newborns who had entered the world in the midst of the coldest winter anyone alive could remember. His visits brought not only medicine, but reassurance. In times when even optimism felt like it had frozen in the air, his presence was a reminder that care still existed. One night, after returning from a long day tending to patients, Dr. Merrick stopped by the Ramseys' home. His cheeks were wind-chapped, his moustache coated in frost. Eleanor immediately poured him a cup of hot tea, and the doctor warmed his hands over the stove. "It's strange," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I've worked through harsh winters before, but this feels different. More severe, as if the season has no intention of loosening its grip." Thomas nodded. "It's the coldest we've ever seen. You think it'll break soon?" The doctor hesitated. "I'd like to believe so, but nature follows its own course." Outside, the wind howled softly, curling around the corners of the house like a living thing. The lantern light flickered, as though responding to the distant cries of the storm. Later that night, as the Ramsay family settled into bed, the temperature plunged again. Windows cracked faintly under the pressure of the cold. The house groaned like a ship in frozen waters. Henry lay awake listening, feeling the weight of the winter settle deep into his bones. Yet even in that profound cold, there were moments of gentle beauty. The sky cleared, revealing stars so sharp and bright they seemed carved from glass. The moon cast a pale glow over the snow-covered fields, turning the landscape into a quiet world of white and silver. It was the kind of night that made the world feel paused, held gently in the stillness of winter's breath. In the quiet hours before dawn, a soft snowfall began. Tiny flakes drifted slowly from the sky, sparkling like dust from a frozen lantern. They settled silently on rooftops, fences, and the sleeping earth, adding yet another layer to the winter that already felt endless. And so, in the heart of America, life continued. Slow, steady, wrapped in blankets, whispered in low voices, illuminated by small islands of warmth. Those who lived through the winter of 1936 would remember it not only for its brutality, but for the way it drew people together. In the harshest cold, the smallest comforts became treasures. Every firelit room, every shared meal, every quiet night spent listening to the wind became a story in itself. As February approached, the cold showed no signs of surrendering its grip. Instead, it tightened, deepened, and settled over the Midwest like an immense invisible glacier. Each new day brought a kind of quiet astonishment. People had begun asking themselves, how is it possible for the world to be this cold for this long? The newspapers printed temperature charts that dropped lower with each sunrise. Thermometers cracked, fuel reserves thinned, and though the harshness of the weather was undeniable, there remained a strange, serene rhythm to life, an acceptance that winter had become the storyteller now, and everyone else was simply listening. At the Ramsay farm, the daily routines continued with unwavering discipline, even as the family's breath fogged inside the house during early mornings. The woodpile shrank faster than Thomas liked to admit, and every other day he had to venture into the grove to chop more. The trees there stood silent and unyielding, their branches thick with rime. Each swing of his axe echoed like a distant drumbeat across the frozen fields. Inside the farmhouse, Eleanor kept the stove burning from dawn until the last hour before midnight. Simple meals, warm porridge, thick soups, dark bread, became small ceremonies of comfort. Little Alice loved watching the steam rise from her bowl, as though warm clouds might float up and soften the ceiling beams. Henry, continuing his daily log of the winter, added new entries with a seriousness beyond his 10 years. In careful handwriting he recorded, February 3rd, coldest day yet. Chickens won't go near the yard. Snow squeaks under boots. The sky looks pale and far away. That last observation was one shared by many. The sky did seem distant, washed in tones of silver and white, as though winter had pushed even the heavens further out. Among the locals, conversations often drifted towards stories of survival. Neighbours swapped accounts of frozen wells, jammed locks, or long nights spent tending to fires that refused to stay lit. Yet these shared struggles strengthened the sense of community. When Mr. Jensen's barn door froze shut one morning, 5 neighbours arrived with tools and lanterns within an hour. When the O'Leary family ran low on firewood, the Ramsays and 2 other households delivered enough to last the week. People didn't ask for help. Help simply arrived. Still, the cold brought with it moments of genuine danger. On the morning of February 6th, the Ramsay family awoke to find their water pump frozen solid for the first time all winter. Thomas and Henry bundled up, layering scarves and wool until only their eyes remained visible. As they stepped outside, the cold hit them like a wall. It felt sharp, almost metallic, as if tiny needles floated in the air. Working together, father and son heated metal tools in the fire and carried them out to the pump. The process was slow. Henry's fingers tingled painfully beneath his gloves. Thomas's breath came in shallow bursts, but eventually, with a low crack, water sputtered forth again, steaming faintly in the frigid air. Henry looked up at his father, cheeks red and eyes watery from the cold. "Do you think it'll end soon?" Thomas paused, gazing over the silent fields blanketed in white. "Winters always end," he said quietly, "even the hardest ones. We just have to outlast it." That phrase, outlast it, became a quiet mantra in the house. In town, the general store had turned into an informal meeting place. With supplies dwindling, residents came not only to purchase goods but to exchange updates. The owner, Mrs. Latimer, kept a pot of coffee simmering on the stove for anyone who stepped inside. The warmth and smell alone were often enough to lift spirits. One afternoon, as a light snow drifted outside, several townsfolk gathered near the counter, discussing the most recent weather reports. A farmer named Caldwell shook his head. "The radio says it's the coldest February on record. They're calling it a once-in-a-century winter." "Once in a lifetime," another corrected. "My grandfather never saw anything like this, and he survived the blizzard of '88. Though their words carried weight, there was no panic in the room. Instead, there was a steady resilience, an understanding that they were living through history, and that someday, these very days would be retold as stories, passed down in warm kitchens or by crackling fires. On that same day, back at the farm, something unusual occurred, something quiet but memorable. Just before dusk, as the sun dipped low behind a curtain of pale clouds, a sudden, brief stillness washed across the land. The wind stopped entirely. Even the branches, usually trembling under the weight of frost, stood motionless. The silence was so complete that Henry, standing near the barn with a bucket in hand, felt as though the world had paused. Then he heard it, a faint, distant crack. Not loud or alarming, but unmistakable. It rolled across the fields like a muted thunderclap. Thomas stepped out of the barn, his brow furrowed. "River ice," he murmured. "Must be shifting again." But it didn't sound like mere shifting. It sounded ancient, like the groan of something vast and frozen stirring beneath the land. The moment passed quickly. Within seconds the wind picked up again, brushing the snow across the fields in soft currents. Yet Henry carried that sound with him into the house, where he recounted it to Eleanor, who listened with attentive eyes. "That's the river reminding us it's still alive," she said gently, smoothing his hair. "Even in the coldest winter, nature doesn't sleep." That night, as the family settled into their quilts, the distant groans of the ice carried faintly across the fields, slow, rhythmic, almost like the earth was breathing very softly under its blanket of snow. And though the cold remained unbroken, though the winter felt endless, there was now a quiet awareness in the Ramsay home. Beneath the frozen world, movement still existed. Life continued, and spring, though distant, was not gone. As the days drifted deeper into February, the winter of 1936 shaped life into a pattern that felt timeless, slow, hushed, and strangely introspective. Each morning arrived like a pale curtain lifting gently over the landscape, revealing fields blanketed in unbroken white. The snow was so deep and so untouched in certain places that it resembled an endless sheet of linen spread across the earth. At the Ramsay farm, a soft stillness greeted the family each dawn. The cold was no longer startling. It had become a familiar companion, ever present, woven into the rhythm of their every movement. Even the sound of the kettle whistling in the kitchen felt louder, sharper, as if the winter air amplified every detail. One morning, just after sunrise, Eleanor stepped outside to shake out several blankets. As she moved across the porch, the wooden boards groaned beneath her feet. The air was crisp enough to sting her lungs. When she exhaled, her breath formed delicate clouds that lingered longer than usual, as though reluctant to disappear. She paused for a moment, looking over the fields. A thin veil of frost coated everything. The trees, the fence posts, even the clothesline. It glimmered beautifully in the early light, like thousands of tiny crystals had fallen from the sky overnight. She found herself smiling despite the biting cold. Winter had a way of disguising even hardship with moments of quiet beauty. Inside, Henry had begun sketching simple drawings in the margins of his winter log. He drew snowdrifts larger than houses, barns half buried, ice-coated riverbanks that looked foreign and wild. His drawings were not perfect, but they captured something essential: the scale, the stillness, the quiet of this strange season. Little Alice, who had grown used to the cold like a small creature born into it, played at the hearth with wooden toys. She built small imaginary towns and covered them with snow, which was really just flour shaken lightly from the palm of her hand. Each time she sprinkled a new layer, she'd whisper, "Another storm," mimicking the adults' conversations. Thomas watched his children with a mixture of pride and quiet reflection. This winter would be a story they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Not just the hardships, but the closeness, the evenings spent huddled together, the shared meals, the sound of the wind singing against the windows while the fire crackled gently nearby. Yet beyond the warm glow of the Ramsay home, stories of the cold's true severity continued to circulate across the region. In the nearby town of Appleton, the schoolhouse had to shut down for 2 full weeks because the cast-iron stove cracked from the cold. In Fargo, a delivery truck froze solid overnight, its engine block turned brittle as glass. There were even tales of birds found perfectly preserved on branches, caught, mid-flight, by sudden cold snaps that seemed impossible to predict. Travel became risky, and in many cases, impossible. Those who attempted long journeys often returned with frostbitten fingers, or not at all. As a result, communities turned inward. Neighbours became each other's lifelines. People who had spoken only in passing during warmer months now shared fires, meals, and long conversations out of necessity. The Ramsays were no exception. One afternoon, just as the sun dipped low and cast long, blue shadows across the fields, a knock sounded at the door. When Thomas opened it, he found Mr. and Mrs. Porter, an older couple from a nearby farm, standing bundled tightly in coats and scarves. Their faces were flushed from the cold. They apologised for the intrusion, explaining that their chimney had collapsed under the weight of ice and snow, leaving them temporarily without heat. Without hesitation, the Ramsays welcomed them inside. Eleanor prepared hot tea, and the Porters warmed themselves near the stove, grateful for the refuge. Their presence filled the house with a soft hum of conversation. Together they shared stories of winters past, of the blizzards that struck when they were children, of neighbours long gone and towns that used to exist. "We thought we had seen the worst winters already," Mr. Porter said, shaking his head. "But this one feels different. Feels like the land's been frozen all the way to the core." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "Winters test us. This one's testing us more than most." Later that night, after the Porters had settled into the guest room with extra quilts piled high, a gentle snow began to fall. The flakes drifted so slowly they looked like they were floating rather than falling, each one illuminated softly in the lantern light shining from the window. The world seemed suspended in silence. The next morning the Porters departed with renewed warmth, promising to return the kindness tenfold when the winter finally released its grip. As their figures grew smaller across the snowy path, Thomas felt a quiet sense of gratitude. Hard winters reminded people what truly mattered: friendship, hospitality, simple kindness. That afternoon, the wind shifted. It carried with it a low, distant sound from the river. A deep, resonant crack echoed across the land, the kind of sound that made even seasoned farmers pause mid-stride and listen carefully. The Ramsay family stepped outside, scanning the horizon. The river, frozen into vast sheets of pale blue ice, glinted sharply under the winter sun. The sound came again, longer this time, rising like a mournful groan from beneath the surface. "It's thickening," Thomas murmured. "Ice expands in the cold. It's just settling." But Henry shivered involuntarily. There was something powerful about the sound, something ancient like the voice of the land itself shifting in its sleep. As evening fell, the air grew even colder. The moon rose early, casting a luminous glow over the snowfields. Inside the house, the family sat close around the stove, their shadows flickering on the walls. Outside, the river cracked again, distant but clear. Inside, the Ramsays felt the warmth of their small world holding firm against the cold, and so February continued, harsh, quiet, and strangely beautiful. A winter that would eventually earn its place in history, not only for the records it broke, but for the way it reshaped every heartbeat, every breath, every night spent waiting for spring. As February moved slowly toward its end, the cold deepened into something almost otherworldly. The kind of cold that made the air shimmer at midday, that hollowed out every sound and left the world wrapped in an endless soft stillness. To many living through it, the winter of 1936 no longer felt like a passing season. It felt like a vast, ancient force that had laid its hand upon the land and refused to lift it. At the Ramsey farm, life had settled into a profoundly quiet rhythm. Each day began with the same sequence of sounds: the creaking of the old wooden stairs, the hiss of the stove catching fire, the soft scraping of frost from the inside of the windows. Even the animals, usually restless in winter, had grown calmer, as though the cold persuaded them into an almost meditative stillness. One morning, Henry was the first to awake. He padded softly across the floor, wrapped in a blanket, and peered out the frosted window. What he saw made him pause. The world looked transformed, not merely blanketed in snow, but sculpted. The night's cold had crystallized the moisture in the air into soft, feather-like frost formations along the fences, trees, and even the barn. Each branch appeared to be covered in white lace. Each post shimmered as if dusted with powdered diamonds. It was breathtaking, like stepping into a painting frozen in time. He immediately ran to wake Alice and Eleanor. "Come look." The world turned white again, whiter than before. The family gathered at the window, marvelling at the quiet spectacle. The sunlight, though weak, cast long ribbons of gold across the frost, illuminating it with a soft, ethereal glow. For a moment no one spoke. They simply admired the scene, letting the beauty settle over them. But beauty did not ease the hardships of daily life. Later that day, as Thomas returned from the barn, he noticed the faint crunch of his boots sounded sharper, the air colder than it had been even the day before. He paused to look at the sky. It had taken on a pale, flat grey hue, a warning sign of something new approaching. When he stepped inside, Eleanor immediately noticed his expression. "What is it?" she asked quietly. "Feels like another cold front coming in," he murmured, hanging his coat by the door. "Stronger than the last." Eleanor exchanged a worried glance with him, but neither voiced the fear that lingered quietly in their minds. How much more could they endure? That evening the wind grew restless. It scratched faintly at the windows and whistled through the smallest gaps between the boards. The temperature plunged more quickly than usual. By midnight, frost had crept deeper inside the house, edging along the window frames like delicate crystalline vines. The Ramseys slept close to one another that night, their breaths rising in clouds in the coldest corners of the room. Even with the stove burning at full strength, the air beyond a few feet of its warmth felt like ice. In the darkest hours before dawn, something unusual happened. A brief tremor shook the ground, just enough to rattle a few dishes in the kitchen. Eleanor woke immediately, sitting upright in bed. She listened carefully, her hand resting gently on Alice's back. The tremor faded as quickly as it came. When Thomas woke, he checked the house and the farmstead thoroughly, lantern in hand. Nothing appeared broken or disturbed, but he couldn't shake the strange sense that the land itself was shifting under the weight of the cold. "It's the river," he said quietly when he returned to bed. "Ice expands. Sometimes it shakes the ground when it shifts all at once." "That must be it," Eleanor replied softly, though she wasn't entirely convinced. It felt deeper than that, like something old and buried had stirred. The next morning, word spread quickly throughout the community. Several families had felt the tremor. Some said it rattled their windows. Others claimed it sounded like a distant boom, muffled by snow-covered hills. A few believed it was frost sinking deep into the earth. But the truth no one wanted to admit was this: no one knew exactly what caused it. In the general store, the mood was unusually subdued. People kept their voices low, as though speaking too loudly might disturb whatever had shifted during the night. Mrs. Latimer, the store owner, wiped her hands on her apron and said, "Strange things happen in winters like this. Nature behaves in ways we're not used to seeing." A farmer standing nearby nodded. "When the cold goes this deep, it changes things, makes the earth feel different under your feet." Despite the talk, life continued. People bought flour, kerosene, salt, and what little fresh produce remained. and as always there was a shared understanding in the room, a kind of collective endurance. That afternoon, as Thomas and Henry made their way to the grove to cut more firewood, they discovered another sign of how severe the cold had become, a fallen tree completely encased in clear ice, as if it had been dipped into glass. Each twig was preserved with perfect clarity, suspended in frozen stillness. It was both beautiful and eerie, like a sculpture crafted by the winter itself. Thomas touched the ice and drew his hand back quickly. It was so cold it burned. "Best leave it," he said quietly. "Some things are meant to stay as they are." Henry stared at the frozen tree for a long time, sensing something profound he couldn't quite put into words. That night the temperature dropped lower still. According to the gauges at the local station, it reached one of the coldest recorded readings in Midwest history, numbers so low they almost didn't seem real. Inside the Ramsey home, the fire glowed bright, fighting against the deep cold pressing from all sides. The family gathered close, their shadows flickering on the walls. Eleanor told a gentle story before bedtime, a tale of settlers who survived a great northern winter long before railroads or electric lights existed. Her voice soothed the children, her words weaving warmth through the room. When the story ended, she tucked the quilts around them and whispered, "Sleep warm, little ones. Spring will come." Outside, the wind swept softly across the fields, carrying with it a quiet promise that even the longest, coldest winters would one day fade. By late February 1936, the cold had begun to reach a turning point, though few noticed it at first. The bitter grip of winter remained, but subtle changes whispered across the landscape. Snow fell more gently, the sun lingered slightly longer in the sky, and the wind no longer sliced through coats with the same merciless intensity. People, conditioned to expect relentless cold, began to sense the faint promise of thaw, even if the temperatures remained unforgiving. At the Ramsey farm, the family felt the shift almost imperceptibly. Thomas noticed that the frost patterns on the windows were slightly thinner in the mornings. Eleanor observed that the smoke from the chimney rose more freely, carried higher by a less frigid air. The livestock seemed calmer, moving with slightly less stiffness in their joints. Even Henry remarked that the river's ice, long frozen into jagged, unnatural ridges, looked less opaque, with cracks and fissures reflecting the weak winter sunlight. But the thaw, when it came, would not arrive gently. It would bring its own trials, as if the winter wanted to remind everyone that even relief could be dangerous. In the small town of Bemidji, Minnesota, townsfolk had begun to notice the first signs of melting along riverbanks and low-lying fields. Snowbanks that had seemed eternal were shrinking, leaving behind patches of muddy ground and frozen puddles. While the change felt promising, it also carried hazards. Ice, long trusted as solid, began to give way unpredictably. Children venturing onto frozen ponds suddenly discovered soft spots where water bubbled beneath a fragile crust. Farmers returning from distant fields found that equipment, previously immobile in frost, could now sink into mud, straining horses and men alike. Despite these dangers, the mood in the community shifted subtly. The long weeks of enduring unrelenting cold had created a collective patience. People moved more deliberately, spoke more gently, and offered help more readily. The thawing did not bring panic. It brought preparation and cautious optimism. At the Ramsey farm, Thomas and Henry ventured out early one morning to check the cattle. The fields were a patchwork of hard-packed snow and newly revealed brown earth. Thomas noticed how the ice along the river had begun to break into massive slabs, moving slowly in the weak currents. The sound was deep and resonant, a groaning that seemed to echo across the landscape. "Nature's voice," Thomas said quietly, gazing at the shifting ice. "Even in its thaw, it commands respect." Henry shivered, though not from cold. "It sounds alive," he said. Thomas nodded. "It is. The land speaks, son, and we've learned how to listen." Inside, Eleanor prepared a simple breakfast of oatmeal and hot tea. Little Alice played nearby, stacking small blocks she'd rescued from the frost. Her laughter, soft and bright, carried across the house, a reminder that life persisted even amid hardship. The days following that morning brought the thaw more steadily. Streams that had vanished beneath thick layers of ice began to trickle once again. Snowbanks softened and collapsed, sending cascades of white powder into the streets. Mail routes slowly reopened, though travel remained slow and treacherous. In town, neighbours shared tales of survival from the coldest days. The family who had huddled in a single bedroom for warmth, the farmer who had heated his home with every scrap of wood in the barn, the children who had learned to find entertainment in small acts of imagination while snowbound. These stories were told not with fear, but with reverence, reminders of resilience in the face of overwhelming winter. Yet the thaw brought a new awareness. Water, ice, and snow now carried the potential for sudden damage. Flooding became a concern in low-lying areas. Roads once frozen solid turned into thick mud, trapping wagons and sleds. The river, long frozen into a deceptive stillness, threatened to rise quickly as ice shifted and broke apart. Even in these challenges, communities came together. Residents of Bemidji and surrounding towns formed informal brigades, clearing blocked roads, reinforcing riverbanks, and helping neighbours protect homes from potential flooding. Children, who had once learned caution on ice, now assisted in simple ways, gathering firewood, carrying messages, and lending a hand wherever possible. At the Ramsey farm, Thomas oversaw the work with measured calm. He reminded Henry and Alice that the thaw required vigilance, not panic. "The winter has been harsh," he said, "but it is not over. We must respect what remains of it and prepare for what is coming." Eleanor, always the voice of reassurance, added warmth to their efforts. She encouraged neighbours and visitors, offering hot meals and a place to rest. Even as the thaw brought challenges, her presence reminded everyone that human kindness could soften any winter's harshness. By the final week of February, signs of the approaching end of winter became more consistent. Days grew slightly longer, temperatures climbed slowly but steadily, and the relentless winds of January had lost some of their sharpness. For those who had endured the coldest winter in US history, the thaw was not just a relief, it was a quiet celebration of survival, patience, and the enduring human spirit. And yet, the story of 1936 would not be remembered solely for the cold. It would also be remembered for the resilience it inspired, the bonds it strengthened, and the beauty it revealed in moments of quiet endurance. For even in the harshest winters, life persisted, and those who listened closely could hear its subtle, unyielding rhythm. As March gradually approached, the thaw from the brutal winter of 1936 began to spread across the Midwest. But it arrived in careful, measured steps. The land, so long imprisoned by frost, seemed reluctant to give itself back to warmth. Snowbanks lingered in shaded areas, icy ruts blocked roads, and rivers, still topped with fractured sheets of ice, reminded residents that winter had not yet released its final grip. At the Ramsey farm, life continued with cautious optimism. Thomas and Henry worked together to clear paths to the barn and pasture, carefully navigating areas where the ice beneath the snow had softened. Each step required attention. The thaw, gentle though it seemed, carried dangers hidden under deceptively white surfaces. The cattle moved slowly across frozen muddy fields, their hooves sinking slightly into the softened earth, but they were unharmed. The family was relieved. The survival of their livestock had been one of their deepest concerns throughout the long months. Eleanor spent her days preparing meals that were heartier now, using preserved vegetables and salted meats to supplement what little fresh food could be obtained. She worked efficiently, her movements almost meditative, letting the simple rhythm of domestic care steady her spirit. The children, Henry and Alice, had developed routines of their own. Henry continued to maintain his winter log, now noting the slow thaw, changes in the river, and signs of emerging wildlife. Alice, fascinated by the subtle melting patterns in the snow and ice, collected tiny icicles and frost crystals to examine, marvelling at their delicate beauty. The community, too, had begun to adapt to the changing conditions. Farmers, previously immobilized by the frozen fields, started making cautious forays to repair fences and inspect winter-damaged equipment. Townspeople, long isolated, ventured outdoors more regularly, their conversations carrying over the crisp air, soft and muffled against the lingering snow. Even as thaw brought relief, it also reminded everyone that vigilance was necessary. Ice could collapse, rivers could flood, and mud could trap the unwary. One afternoon, Thomas noticed something remarkable along the riverbank. Chunks of ice, once uniform and glassy, were shifting in slow, deliberate movements. The river's surface, cracked and uneven, seemed almost alive, groaning and clicking as the thaw progressed. He called Henry over to observe. "Look at that," he said. "Even in thaw, winter speaks. The ice moves slowly but with purpose. It reminds us how strong it's been and how patient we need to be." Henry nodded, absorbing the lesson. It was a small but profound insight. The land, like the people enduring it, had its own rhythms, its own quiet lessons waiting for those willing to notice. Elsewhere in the region, towns faced the first practical consequences of thawing ice and snow. Flooding became a concern as rivers swelled with melting snow. Roads, previously frozen solid, turned to mud, creating treacherous conditions for travel. In some areas, collapsed roofs and broken fences served as reminders that winter's strength had been underestimated. But once again, communities responded with determination. People formed teams to reinforce riverbanks, dig drainage channels, and assist neighbours whose homes were at risk. There was no panic, just steady, careful action, born of months spent enduring and adapting to extreme conditions. The local schoolhouse reopened cautiously. Children, many of whom had been cooped up for weeks, returned to class bundled in layers of wool and scarves. Teachers spoke quietly about the importance of patience and careful movement outside, but they also noticed a spark in the children's eyes, an appreciation for the small joys of spring creeping slowly back into their world. At the Ramsay home, evening brought warmth and reflection. Eleanor prepared a simple supper, and the family gathered around the stove. The glow from the fire cast long shadows across the walls, revealing the intricate frost patterns still clinging to the windows. The family spoke in low, gentle tones, sharing observations from the day and discussing the subtle signs of the ongoing thaw. Henry noted the return of birdsong, small, hesitant chirps that seemed tentative after months of silence. Alice, fascinated, peered outside to watch the first signs of buds forming on trees. Even the snow, slowly receding, revealed patches of brown and green beneath, signalling that life, though quiet, persisted under the frozen surface. Thomas reflected on the months of cold, hardship and endurance. The winter had tested every person, every family, every community. Yet it had also revealed resilience, compassion, and quiet courage. Strangers had become allies. Neighbours had shared warmth, food, and guidance. Children had learned patience and observation, and adults had discovered the strength of shared effort. As night fell, the Ramsay family prepared for bed. The temperature inside the house was still brisk but bearable. Each member settled beneath heavy quilts, their breaths forming faint clouds in the cool air. Outside, the river groaned softly as ice shifted again, a reminder that even in thaw, winter's presence lingered. Eleanor whispered to her children, "Sleep now. The frost will keep us company tonight, but soon warmth will return." And outside, under the pale light of a winter moon, the land lay suspended between cold and renewal, quiet, patient, and eternal. The winter of 1936 was far from over, but the signs of life returning, soft, subtle, and beautiful, offered hope. Those who had endured its longest, coldest days began to understand the value of patience, the importance of community, and the enduring power of simple acts of care. As March progressed, the thaw continued, slow and deliberate, like a painter adding gentle strokes of warmth to a frozen canvas. For most of the Midwest, the winter of 1936 had become not just a season, but a measure of endurance. People had grown accustomed to the extremes, record-breaking cold, frozen rivers, and snowdrifts that seemed to stretch forever. Now, as the days lengthened and the sun lingered faintly above the horizon, hope seeped into the landscape like sunlight warming the icy edges of a stream. At the Ramsay farm, the daily rhythms were beginning to change. Thomas and Henry took longer walks across the fields, inspecting areas previously inaccessible due to deep snow and treacherous ice. They found signs of life emerging from beneath the frozen ground, small shoots of grass, the first stubborn sprouts of early flowers, and traces of wildlife that had managed to survive. Tracks of rabbits, deer, and even foxes were visible in the partially melted snow, evidence of resilience that mirrored the human spirit around them. Inside the farmhouse, Eleanor had begun planning for spring planting, though carefully. The soil, still damp and uneven from melting snow, required patience before seeds could be sown. Meanwhile, she continued to provide warmth and nourishment, turning simple ingredients into hearty meals that kept the family strong. Little Alice delighted in exploring the small puddles forming along the edges of the porch, discovering tiny frozen shapes that glistened like crystals in the pale sunlight. Henry, ever observant, recorded the thaw in meticulous detail, noting temperatures, snow depth and changes in animal activity. His notebook, once a chronicle of bitter cold, now included the beginnings of life returning to the land. Beyond the farm, towns slowly reawakened. Roads cleared enough for carts and wagons to travel, though mud and remaining ice made progress slow. Businesses reopened fully, and neighbours ventured further from their homes to check on friends and family. Communities that had been isolated for weeks came together, sharing news, resources, and cautious optimism. People spoke quietly of the challenges they had endured, but also of the lessons learned: resilience, resourcefulness, and the value of human connection. The thawing rivers became a source of both fascination and concern. In Bemidji, residents watched as chunks of ice shifted and floated downstream, sometimes colliding with a resonant crash that echoed across the valley. Children approached cautiously, marveling at the power of the moving ice. Adults, however, reminded them that danger lingered even in the softened landscape. The rivers, though less frozen, could be unpredictable, and the ground near them often unstable. At the Ramsey farm, Thomas noticed the ice cracking with a deep, resonant groan as he checked the river near the pasture. It was a sound that had become familiar during the winter, but now it carried a slightly different tone, less threatening, yet still commanding respect. He gestured for Henry to observe. "Even in thaw," he said, "the land demands our attention. Never forget that, son. It teaches patience, respect, and humility." Henry nodded solemnly, understanding not just the lesson about the river, but the larger lesson of enduring hardship with awareness and care. As evenings grew longer, Eleanor took to sitting by the window, watching the sunset lights stretch across the partially melted snowfields. The sky, often pale and flat during the deepest cold, now shimmered with delicate hues of gold and rose. She found herself reflecting on the months past, on the days of relentless frost, the nights of wind and groaning ice, the moments of quiet solidarity with neighbours and strangers alike. The winter had been severe, yes, but it had revealed the strength and beauty in everyday acts: sharing firewood, offering a warm meal, tending to children and animals, listening to the land itself. The family's evenings became increasingly filled with storytelling. Eleanor would recount tales of previous winters, blending history with legend in ways that mesmerised Henry and Alice. These stories, read by the warm glow of the stove, brought comfort and continuity, a reminder that even the harshest seasons eventually passed, leaving lessons and memories behind. One particularly clear evening, after a day of careful work in the thawing fields, Thomas, Henry, and Eleanor stepped outside to witness the river in motion. Large sheets of ice slowly drifted downstream, bumping against each other with muffled thuds. The sight was hypnotic, a reminder that even frozen landscapes could carry motion and life beneath their surface. Alice, pointing to a faint patch of green breaking through the melting snow, squealed with delight. "Look! Life is waking up." Thomas smiled, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "Yes, Alice. Winter has held tightly, but spring is patient. It waits, quietly, until the time is right." Henry, recording the event in his notebook, noted, "The river moves again. Ice groans and drifts. Green sprouts emerge from snow. Life continues." As night fell, the family returned to the warmth of their home. The stove glowed brighter than ever, and the familiar creaks and groans of the old farmhouse had taken on a gentler tone. Outside, the wind whispered softly, carrying the scent of thawing snow and wet earth. The world, once frozen in rigid stillness, now breathed slowly, deliberately, awakening after its long slumber. In these days, the winter of 1936 began to transform in memory. It was no longer solely a story of harsh cold, frozen rivers, and snowdrifts. It became a story of endurance, patience, and quiet beauty. Those who had lived through it remembered the hardships, but also the warmth of home, the support of community, and the delicate, extraordinary signs of life that persisted beneath ice and snow. By the beginning of April 1936, the thaw had grown more pronounced. Snowbanks shrank noticeably each day, revealing dark, damp soil beneath. The river, once solid and menacing, flowed freely in patches, with ice breaking apart and floating downstream in slow, deliberate arcs. Even the wind had lost its sharp bite, now carrying faint hints of warmth and the earthy scent of melting snow. At the Ramsey farm, life had begun to return to a more normal rhythm. Thomas and Henry spent hours in the fields, repairing fences damaged by ice and wind. The ground was still soft and uneven, but it was navigable, and the livestock responded well to the renewed freedom. Cows ventured farther from the barns, and the chickens pecked actively for scraps of early growth. Every small sign of life was a quiet celebration, proof that survival was possible and that the hardships of the long winter were easing. Inside, Eleanor embraced the signs of spring. She cleaned the home thoroughly, airing quilts that had absorbed the damp cold, and prepared meals with ingredients scavenged from the thawed soil. The smell of fresh herbs, combined with the comforting aroma of baking bread, brought warmth and optimism to the household. Little Alice enjoyed helping, stirring dough or sprinkling flour on the table, while Henry meticulously updated his winter log, noting the gradual changes in temperatures, snow depth, and wildlife activity. The thaw also brought a deeper sense of community. Neighbours checked on one another more frequently, offering assistance in repairing damaged barns, reinforcing weakened roofs, and clearing mud-choked paths. People shared news of other areas affected by the winter, recounting tales of resilience and resourcefulness. In towns like Bemidji and Morris, informal gatherings formed to help those who had struggled most during the harshest weeks. The shared experience of survival had bonded communities in ways that would be remembered long after the snow melted. One morning, as Thomas and Henry walked along the river to assess the ice breaking apart, they observed a remarkable sight. A large tree, uprooted by the weight of ice and snow during the coldest weeks, had become lodged near the riverbank. The flowing water had begun to carve channels around it, and birds, perhaps the first returning from southern migrations, perched upon its icy limbs. The juxtaposition of frozen branches and flowing water fascinated Henry. "Look at it, father," he said, pointing. "It's like winter and spring are sharing the same space." Thomas nodded. "Exactly. Winter fought hard, but spring will win in time. Everything has its rhythm." Even the townsfolk were drawn to moments of beauty. Children, once confined indoors for weeks on end, ran through partially melted fields, their boots squelching in the mud. They discovered the joy of melting icicles dripping from rooftops, forming tiny puddles to splash in. Adults paused to admire delicate frost formations dissolving in sunlight and to appreciate the sounds of flowing water returning to creeks and rivers. In the general store, Mrs. Latimer noticed a change in conversation. Patrons no longer spoke solely of survival and caution. They began to plan for planting, repairs, and future gatherings. The thaw inspired cautious hope, tempered by the memory of the winter's severity. People discussed the upcoming planting season, the needs of livestock, and the careful timing required to avoid further mishaps from lingering frost pockets. At the Ramsey home, the family maintained evening rituals. After supper, they gathered by the stove, sharing observations from the day, telling stories and enjoying the quiet companionship of one another. The fire's warmth now reached more corners of the house, aided by slightly higher ambient temperatures. Night still carried a chill, but it was gentler, easier to bear, and allowed for more restful sleep. On one particularly clear evening, Henry and Alice ventured outside to watch the sky turn shades of pink and gold as the sun set. Snowbanks reflected the soft light, and distant hills shimmered with melting ice. Alice collected small pools of water that had formed from melting snow, marvelling at the tiny ripples. Henry observed the tracks of deer returning to newly accessible fields. "It's like the land is waking up," Henry whispered. Alice nodded. "Everything is alive again." Thomas and Eleanor joined them, standing quietly as the wind carried the scent of thawing earth. For the first time in months, there was no pressing fear of frostbite, snowdrifts, or frozen rivers. The winter had not fully released its hold, but life was returning steadily, with patience and quiet grace. That night, the family settled under thick quilts, listening to the soft murmur of the river as ice slabs floated downstream. The house creaked gently, no longer as harshly as it had in the peak of winter. Outside, the faint sound of birds returning carried on the breeze, a melody that felt like a promise. The winter of 1936, though extraordinary in its severity, was gradually becoming a memory, a shared experience etched into the lives and hearts of those who endured it. The thaw revealed not only the resilience of the land, but also the resilience of people, families who had protected one another, communities that had come together, and children who had learned patience and observation in ways that would shape them forever. For the Ramsays, the thaw signalled more than the return of warmth. It marked a moment of reflection, gratitude, and quiet celebration. Life persisted, slowly reclaiming the frozen world, and with it came the knowledge that even the harshest winters eventually give way to renewal. As April deepened, the thaw accelerated. The snowbanks, which had dominated the landscape for months, receded quickly, revealing the muted browns and greens of earth emerging from winter's grasp. The ice along the river broke apart with increasing frequency, sending large slabs slowly downstream, groaning as they collided and shifted. The sound, once alarming during the height of winter, now carried a rhythm that felt natural, almost musical, a signal that the long season of cold was finally giving way. At the Ramsay farm, life had returned to a new kind of routine, one that balanced caution with the gentle excitement of early spring. Thomas and Henry spent their mornings walking the fields, repairing fences damaged by ice, and checking the health of livestock. The cattle, cautious at first, began venturing farther from the barns, their breath forming faint clouds in the soft morning air. Chickens scratched at the thawing earth, revealing tiny shoots of grass and the first early insects, small yet vital reminders that the cycle of life persisted. Eleanor's days were filled with the simple work of domestic care, but also the subtle joys of spring. She aired quilts that had absorbed the damp cold, polished floors to remove traces of mud from thawing paths, and prepared meals that balanced warmth with the return of fresh ingredients. She often paused at the window to watch Alice, who had developed a fascination with small signs of life emerging from the snow. Tiny puddles forming from melted icicles, birds returning cautiously to feeder areas, and the subtle green of grass beginning to push through the frozen soil. Henry continued his careful observations, filling pages of his winter log with descriptions of the thaw, temperatures rising, snow depth decreasing, and wildlife activity gradually returning. He included sketches of river ice fracturing and floating downstream, as well as tracks from deer and rabbits that had survived the harsh months. These notes, once solely a record of survival, now captured the quiet resurgence of life across the land. The community too began to reawaken. In towns like Bemidji, Morris, and surrounding areas, neighbours ventured outside more regularly, checking on friends, repairing damage to homes, and preparing for the planting season. People who had been isolated during the long cold now shared stories of survival, weaving lessons learned into conversations and strengthening bonds that had formed under extreme circumstances. The thaw, though gradual, fostered a subtle sense of renewal, not just in the land, but in the human spirit. One afternoon, Thomas and Henry walked along the riverbank to inspect the ice that had dominated the landscape for months. Large slabs were breaking and drifting downstream, clinking and groaning softly in the current. They noticed a fallen tree, trapped near the bank, its branches coated in a delicate layer of ice. Birds had begun perching upon it, their small bodies adding colour and movement to the frozen structure. "Look at that," Thomas said quietly. "Even winter's strongest work eventually gives way to life." Henry studied the scene. "It's strange," he said, "to see the frozen and the alive together." Thomas smiled. "That's the way of the world, son. Hardship doesn't last forever, and even when life seems frozen, there's always movement underneath. We just have to pay attention." The evenings at the Ramsay home became more filled with quiet reflection and storytelling. Eleanor would recount tales of previous winters, combining history with gentle moral lessons. Henry and Alice listened attentively, often asking questions about the resilience of families, communities, and wildlife. These stories, shared under the warm glow of the stove, created a comforting ritual that reminded the family of the importance of patience, preparation, and hope. In the broader community, the thawing rivers and melting snow also brought challenges. Mudslides on slopes, softening roads, and the risk of flooding required vigilance. Residents worked together, clearing debris, reinforcing embankments, and helping neighbours whose homes were at risk. The thaw was a reminder that relief from hardship could be delicate, requiring both care and cooperation. Despite the ongoing challenges, there was a quiet joy that permeated the days. Children played in the remaining snow, splashing in small puddles and discovering insects emerging from thawed soil. Adults paused to admire the subtle changes in the landscape, the first green shoots, the soft murmur of running water, and the distant return of birdsong. Inside the Ramsay farmhouse, the family gathered nightly to share observations from the day. The fire crackled gently in the stove, warming the room and casting soft shadows across the walls. Eleanor would tuck the children under heavy quilts, whispering reminders that spring, though still cautious, was approaching steadily. Thomas often added thoughts about patience, resilience, and the quiet strength of enduring hardship. As night fell, the river groaned softly with shifting ice, and the wind carried the scent of wet earth. The family lay together under warm covers, listening to the gentle sounds of the thawing world outside. It was a moment of quiet reflection, a recognition that even the harshest winters eventually end, leaving lessons, memories, and a renewed appreciation for life itself. The winter of 1936, though marked by unprecedented cold and frozen landscapes, had revealed something profound. The resilience of nature, the strength of human spirit, and the quiet beauty that emerges when endurance meets patience. For the Ramsays, and countless others across the Midwest, survival was not simply a matter of withstanding the cold, it was a matter of noticing life, maintaining hope, and honouring the rhythm of the world around them. By mid-April 1936, the thaw had taken a firm hold. The snowbanks that had once towered along roadsides and fields were now sloping remnants, dotted with patches of mud and early green shoots pushing toward the sunlight. The rivers, freed from their icy prisons, flowed with a gentle but steady current, the shards of broken ice clinking softly as they moved downstream. The once harsh wind now carried the subtle scent of damp earth, moss, and early blossoms, quiet reminders that life persisted under even the harshest winter. At the Ramsay farm, life had fully adapted to this new phase of the season. Thomas and Henry spent much of their days repairing fences, preparing pastures, and carefully tending to livestock that were finally venturing farther from the barns. Cows grazed cautiously on the emerging green grass, their movements fluid again after months of confinement in snowy enclosures. Chickens scratched and pecked eagerly at the thawing soil, while the sounds of birds, cardinals, sparrows, and blue jays, added colour and melody to the landscape. Eleanor's domestic routines had shifted as well. She now baked with fresh ingredients salvaged from the thawed fields, prepared early seedlings for planting, and spent time teaching Alice to recognise early flowers and sprouts. The children, previously confined by frost and snow, explored the property with renewed curiosity, discovering puddles forming from melted ice and watching tiny insects emerge from soil softened by warmth. These small marvels brought joy and a sense of wonder, reinforcing the family's connection to the changing world. Henry continued to meticulously update his winter log, now recording not just survival, but revival. He described the thawing of rivers, the appearance of wildlife, the return of birds, and the subtle warming of soil. He drew sketches of ice drifting in the river, seedlings pushing through soil, and tracks left by deer and other animals venturing out once more. The log, initially a record of endurance, had transformed into a chronicle of renewal. The community too reflected this sense of cautious optimism. Neighbours ventured further from their homes to inspect damages, repair fences, and prepare for spring planting. Townspeople shared resources, helped with road repairs, and checked on one another's livestock. The thaw had revealed the fragility of life and property after such a harsh winter, yet it had also strengthened bonds of trust and cooperation. People spoke of the winter's lessons, how patience, careful observation, and collaboration had carried them through, and they planned for the spring with cautious hope. One particularly memorable morning, Thomas and Henry walked to the river to inspect the ice and observe the water's flow. Chunks of ice drifted slowly downstream, groaning and shifting as they went. The riverbanks were muddy but firm in most places, and the faint signs of emerging plant life suggested that the soil had survived the prolonged freeze. Near the river, a fallen tree previously encased in thick ice now stood partially submerged in the flowing water, its branches dotted with returning birds and early mosses. Nature's persistence is remarkable, Thomas murmured, watching the river. "Even when the land seems frozen and lifeless, life waits quietly beneath, and when the time is right, it returns." Henry observed the scene in thoughtful silence. "It's like winter and spring are coexisting," he said. "One isn't over yet, but the other is already starting." Thomas nodded. "Exactly. Life has its rhythms. Harsh seasons teach us patience, and gentle ones remind us to pay attention." Across the town and countryside, similar observations were made. Residents marvelled at the delicate frost formations dissolving in sunlight, streams flowing from previously frozen tributaries, and the gradual re-emergence of flora and fauna. Children played cautiously in remaining patches of snow and ice, discovering the joy of small puddles, early flowers, and birdsong. Adults, while mindful of lingering hazards, mud, unstable riverbanks, and late frost pockets, felt a shared sense of accomplishment and relief. In the evenings, the Ramsay family continued their nightly rituals. After a simple dinner, they gathered near the stove to discuss the day, share stories, and reflect on the progress of the thaw. Eleanor's voice, gentle and soothing, recounted tales of past winters and the ways families had adapted to them. Thomas emphasized lessons of endurance, observation, and humility before the forces of nature. Henry and Alice listened intently, their imaginations enriched by the blend of history, observation, and personal experience. The nights themselves had changed as well. While still cool, the air inside the farmhouse was easier to bear, the stove's heat reaching every corner more effectively. The moonlight reflected on the remaining snow with a soft glow, and the gentle murmur of the river created a calming soundtrack to their evenings. Sleep became deeper, more restful, aided by the subtle sounds of life returning to the land. By this point, the winter of 1936 was no longer remembered solely as a period of hardship and record-breaking cold. Its memory included the resilience it inspired, the community bonds it strengthened, and the quiet beauty revealed during months of frozen stillness. Survival, reflection, and careful observation had transformed lives. The Ramsays and their neighbours had endured the most severe season of their lifetimes, yet they had emerged with a profound appreciation for the simple rhythms of life, the importance of preparation, and the quiet, unstoppable persistence of nature. Even as April advanced, the lessons of the winter lingered. The land was renewing itself slowly, but the memory of frost, ice, and record-breaking cold reminded everyone of their capacity for patience, endurance, and empathy. It was a winter that, though harsh, had left a legacy of awareness, community, and gratitude, an enduring story that would be passed down in conversations, logs, and memories for years to come. By late April 1936, the transformation from winter to spring was unmistakable. The last of the snowbanks crumbled into wet, muddy piles, revealing the dark, damp earth beneath. Streams and rivers, once encased in thick ice, flowed freely and swiftly, carrying remnants of shattered ice downstream with soft clinks and groans. Birdsong filled the air, punctuated by the distant calls of returning migratory species. For those who had endured the coldest winter in US history, these signs of renewal were almost miraculous. At the Ramsay farm, the family had settled into a new rhythm. Thomas and Henry worked steadily outdoors, repairing fences, clearing debris left by ice and snow, and inspecting pastures for damage. Cattle roamed with increasing freedom, grazing on early shoots of grass that peeked above the thawed soil. Chickens scratched eagerly at the dirt, uncovering worms and insects newly revealed from beneath the snow. Every small movement in the land was a quiet triumph, a confirmation that life endured even after the most severe hardships. Eleanor found joy in the return of light and warmth. She tended to the garden, sowing early seeds and nurturing tender sprouts that had survived the winter's grasp. Meals incorporated fresh ingredients when possible, and she guided Alice in small acts of observation and care, examining tiny green shoots, noting bird nests forming in hedgerows, and gently handling the emerging insects that danced across puddles. Life, in its smallest forms, fascinated the children and reminded the adults of the delicate balance they had all maintained through winter. Henry continued his meticulous record-keeping, but his focus had shifted. No longer solely documenting survival and frost depth, he now chronicled the thaw's progress, the melting ice along the river, the reappearance of plant life, the cautious return of wildlife, and even the subtle changes in temperature and sunlight. Each entry reflected a combination of scientific observation and quiet wonder. The log had transformed from a survival journal into a record of rebirth, patience, and the persistent rhythms of nature. The community shared in this renewed sense of life. Neighbours helped one another rebuild structures damaged by ice and wind, reinforced weak riverbanks, and prepared fields for planting. People exchanged stories about the thaw, marvelling at the resilience of both the land and its inhabitants. Children who had been confined by snow and frost played freely in mud puddles, carefully navigating the soft ground while discovering small creatures, emerging flowers, and thawing streams. Adults remained vigilant, mindful of lingering hazards, yet embraced the thaw with cautious optimism. One morning, Thomas took Henry to the river's edge to observe the ice shifting in the current. Large slabs floated downstream, colliding with one another in a slow, resonant rhythm. A fallen tree, once encased entirely in ice, now stood partially submerged, its branches covered with moss and hosting a scattering of returning birds. The scene was a vivid reminder of nature's resilience and adaptability. Even in the harshest winters, Thomas said softly, life waits patiently. It survives quietly beneath the frost, and when the time comes, it emerges. That's what we've learned this year. Henry watched the drifting ice and returning wildlife in thoughtful silence. It feels like the world is waking up, he said, like winter and spring are meeting in the same place. Thomas smiled. Yes, and our job is to observe, to care, and to respect it. That's how we survive and thrive. The return of life was not limited to the farm. Across the region, residents observed the land's revival with quiet reverence. Melting snow revealed wildflowers and early shoots of grass, while birds built nests and filled the air with song. Rivers swelled in places but receded in others, creating temporary wetlands that attracted wildlife and reminded people of the delicate balance between thawing ice and flowing water. The evenings at the Ramsay home became a cherished ritual. After supper, the family gathered near the stove to discuss the day, share observations, and tell stories. Eleanor recounted earlier springs, interweaving them with historical lessons, myths, and gentle reflections on human endurance. Thomas added insights on preparation, patience, and humility before nature's cycles. Henry and Alice listened intently, their minds absorbing not only the facts, but the quiet rhythms of life resuming around them. The night brought a peaceful stillness. Though the air was still cool, the temperature inside the farmhouse was comfortable, and the house itself no longer groaned with the icy stiffness of winter. Outside, the river murmured softly as the ice drifted past. The distant wind rustled the first leaves of returning shrubs, and the faint scent of wet earth filled the air. The family lay under warm quilts, breathing in the subtle chorus of life returning after months of frozen stillness. In these moments, the memory of the coldest winter in US history began to transform. The extreme hardships, record-breaking temperatures, and frozen rivers were no longer merely a story of endurance. They became a narrative of resilience, hope, and the quiet beauty of survival. Communities that had supported one another, children who had learned patience, and adults who had discovered the depth of their own resourcefulness were all part of a living lesson that extended far beyond the farm or town. For the Ramsays, spring's gentle arrival was more than a seasonal change. It was a culmination of months of vigilance, compassion, and adaptation. Life, fragile yet determined, had endured. The land, too, bore witness to the rhythm of survival and renewal. Each bird song, each green sprout, each flowing stream reminded them that even after the harshest winters, life persists, quietly but relentlessly. By early May 1936, the Midwest had fully embraced the warmth of spring. The remnants of snow lay only in shaded hollows, quickly melting under the increasingly strong sun. Rivers, freed from months of ice, flowed steadily, reflecting blue skies and the occasional drifting cloud. Fields, once desolate under a thick blanket of snow, were now a patchwork of brown soil, green shoots, and tender early blooms. It was a season of renewal, yet for those who had endured the harshest winter on record, there was a lingering awareness of the forces they had survived. At the Ramsay farm, the landscape had begun to feel alive once again. Thomas and Henry spent long days repairing fences, planting early crops, and ensuring that the livestock were healthy and safe. Cows grazed freely, their breath misting in the cool morning air, and chickens foraged eagerly among the emerging greenery. The thaw had brought challenges of its own, muddy pastures, slippery riverbanks, and waterlogged fields, but the family approached these with a sense of steady patience, refined through months of enduring cold and scarcity. Eleanor's work shifted to preparing the soil and nurturing early seedlings. She guided Alice in tending small plots, teaching her to recognise the delicate needs of each plant, from careful watering to protecting shoots from frost pockets that still lingered in low-lying areas. Henry observed the gradual awakening of wildlife, sketching birds, insects, and small mammals as they returned to the farm after the long winter. His winter log had transformed into a chronicle not of survival alone, but of life resuming its gentle, deliberate rhythm. Across the wider community, signs of spring renewal were everywhere. Families repaired roofs and fences damaged by ice, cleared roads and pathways, and prepared gardens and fields for planting. Children, once confined to indoor games or cautious snow play, now ran barefoot through softened earth, discovering tadpoles in puddles, insects in thawing soil, and the first wildflowers poking through the brown of lingering mud. Adults moved with a shared purpose, repairing, planting, and rebuilding, but with a sense of relief and quiet joy that only comes after surviving extreme hardship. One morning, Thomas and Henry walked along the river to observe the flow of water after recent rains. The ice had entirely disappeared, leaving only water moving steadily over rocks and shallow banks. Large pieces of driftwood, previously frozen in place, floated lazily downstream, accompanied by the gentle chorus of returning birds and the soft rustle of leaves beginning to unfurl on trees. "Life finds a way," Thomas said quietly. "Even when the world seems frozen, even when survival feels impossible, life continues. That's what we've learned from this winter." Henry, standing barefoot on a warm patch of earth, nodded. "It feels like the land is breathing again," he said, "like everything is waking up at the same time." The transformation was not only physical but emotional. The memory of winter's bitter cold remained vivid. Frozen rivers, snowdrifts taller than humans, and nights where the stove's warmth barely reached the far corners of the house. But these recollections were now balanced with the knowledge of resilience and community. Friends and neighbours shared stories of endurance, quietly marvelling at the ways in which they had supported one another, whether through lending firewood, sharing meals, or simply offering companionship during long dark nights. Evenings at the Ramsay home had taken on a reflective quality. After tending the fields and completing their daily chores, the family gathered near the stove or by the windows to watch the gradual progression of the season. Eleanor told stories blending history, family experiences, and gentle reflections on the natural world, weaving lessons of patience, observation, and gratitude into each narrative. Thomas emphasized the importance of preparation, careful attention, and humility before nature. Henry and Alice listened with rapt attention, absorbing both the practical and philosophical lessons embedded in these shared stories. One particularly serene evening, as the sun dipped low, in the sky, Thomas, Eleanor, and the children stepped outside to watch the river glint in the golden light. The water moved smoothly, reflecting the slowly darkening sky. Birds darted through the air, calling softly to one another. Flowers began to bloom along the riverbank, tiny patches of blue, yellow, and white adding colour to the brown and green landscape. Alice pointed at a small patch of early blooms and whispered excitedly, "Life is everywhere!" Thomas smiled, resting his hand gently on her shoulder. "Yes, Alice, even after the harshest winters, life finds a way, and we've been lucky enough to see it return." Henry, sketchbook in hand, carefully documented the moment. The flowing water, the blooming flowers, the returning birds, and the overall sense of renewal. It was a small but meaningful record, a testament to resilience and the enduring rhythm of nature. That night, the family settled under warm quilts, listening to the soft chorus of the thawing river and the distant calls of returning wildlife. The winter of 1936, once a period of unprecedented cold and isolation, was gradually being remembered not only for its hardships, but for the lessons it taught, the resilience it revealed, and the quiet beauty it unveiled in moments of endurance. For the Ramsays, the return of spring was both literal and symbolic. Life had persevered, and they had survived not merely through preparation but through patience, observation, and care for one another. The memory of the winter lingered, but it was now coloured by gratitude, hope, and the gentle reassurance that the cycles of life, like the rhythms of the river and the thawing land, always continue. By mid-May 1936, the Midwest had transformed almost completely. Fields that had been buried under snow for months now shimmered with tender green growth. The rivers, freed from the last remnants of ice, flowed steadily, reflecting the vibrant sky and the emerging colours of wildflowers along their banks. Birds, once hesitant, now filled the air with song, and small mammals emerged to forage among the thawed grass. For many, including the Ramseys, it felt as though the land itself had been reborn. At the Ramsey farm, the family had settled into a fully established rhythm of spring. Thomas and Henry focused on preparing fields for planting, ensuring soil was tilled and debris from winter ice removed. They checked fences, reinforced barns, and tended to livestock that had adapted to the thawed pastures. Cows grazed freely, their movements fluid and unhurried, while chickens pecked contentedly at the newly exposed ground. Every sound and motion, birds flitting between trees, the gentle ripple of streams, the soft hum of insects, reminded the family of life's persistence, even after the harshest conditions. Eleanor devoted her days to cultivating seedlings and tending the garden. She involved Alice in these tasks, teaching her to plant seeds with care, observe the subtle changes in soil and weather, and nurture life as it slowly emerged from winter's grip. Henry continued documenting the progress in his winter log, recording not just plants and animals, but the emotional journey of enduring and observing nature's rhythms. His sketches showed growing shoots, flowing streams, and returning wildlife, each page a celebration of renewal. In town, the community shared in this revival. Residents repaired roads, bridges and buildings damaged by ice and snow. Fields were cleared for planting, and neighbours helped one another carry out these tasks, sharing tools, labour and encouragement. Children, once confined by snow and frost, explored freely, discovering new insects, puddles and wildflowers. Adults, mindful of lingering hazards such as soft soil and still-thawing riverbanks, approached their tasks with steady care, having learned the value of patience and caution during the harsh months. One morning, Thomas and Henry took a longer walk along the river. The ice was entirely gone, replaced by flowing water moving steadily over rocks and shallow banks. Trees lining the river, previously barren, now displayed tender green leaves, and birds perched on their branches, calling and singing in celebration of spring's arrival. Driftwood and fallen branches from the winter lay scattered along the banks, slowly being carried downstream. "Look at this," Thomas said quietly, gesturing to the water and the emerging greenery. Even the most unyielding winter eventually gives way. Everything waits patiently, and when it's time, life resumes. Henry studied the scene, his eyes following the birds and the water. "It's like the world is breathing again," he said softly. "Exactly," Thomas replied. "And we've learned to breathe with it, to endure, observe and respect the rhythm of nature." Across the broader region, similar signs of renewal were evident. Wet meadows glimmered with early wildflowers, streams ran clear, and wildlife activity surged. Deer and rabbits cautiously ventured into open fields, while birds sang and nested freely. Communities remained alert for minor flooding or soft soil hazards, but the overall mood was one of cautious celebration. People shared stories of survival from the harsh winter, reflecting not on the suffering alone, but on the bonds, resilience, and lessons that had emerged. Evenings at the Ramsey home were a mix of reflection and gentle celebration. After supper, the family gathered near the stove or by the windows to observe the changes in light and landscape. Eleanor recounted stories of past springs, weaving history, practical knowledge, and life lessons into her tales. Thomas emphasized the importance of preparation, observation, and respect for the cycles of nature. Henry and Alice listened attentively, their minds absorbing both factual knowledge and the rhythm of life returning after months of frozen stillness. One particularly serene evening, as the sun dipped behind distant hills, the family stepped outside to watch the river glint in golden light. Birds darted through the air, and wildflowers swayed gently along the banks. Alice pointed at a patch of blue and yellow blooms and whispered, "It's like the world is waking up." Thomas smiled and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Yes, Alice. Even after the coldest winters, life finds a way. and we've been lucky enough to witness it." Henry sketched the scene in his notebook, capturing the interplay of sunlight, water, and greenery. The log, once filled with frost depth and survival notes, had become a record of resilience, renewal, and the quiet beauty of enduring hardship. As night fell, the Ramsays returned to the farmhouse, breathing in the scent of damp earth and soft vegetation. The wind whispered gently through budding trees, and the river flowed steadily in the distance. Under warm quilts, the family reflected on the winter past, recognizing the strength and patience it had demanded. The experience had left them with a profound appreciation for life's resilience, the support of community, and the delicate, persistent rhythm of nature itself. The winter of 1936, once remembered only for its severity, had transformed in their minds into a story of endurance, adaptation, and hope. Its record-breaking cold, frozen rivers and snowdrifts had tested every person, every family, and every community. Yet, in surviving it, the people had discovered their capacity for resilience, observation, and connection to both each other and the natural world. By late May 1936, the Midwest was fully immersed in spring. Fields shimmered with fresh green shoots, rivers flowed freely, and wildlife activity was vibrant. Birds sang from newly leafed trees, insects buzzed among early flowers, and the once barren landscape had come alive with subtle colour and movement. The thaw was complete, but the memory of the coldest winter in US history lingered in the minds of those who had endured it, a reminder of nature's extremes and human resilience. At the Ramsay farm, life had returned to a near-normal rhythm. Thomas and Henry continued planting crops, repairing fences and tending livestock. The cows grazed freely in pastures now lush with tender grass, while chickens pecked eagerly in the soil. Every movement in the farm, the gentle ripple of the river, the soft wind through trees, the occasional call of a returning bird, was a quiet celebration of survival. Eleanor spent her days nurturing seedlings, preparing for the upcoming harvest, and teaching Alice about the intricacies of the natural world. Alice delighted in observing insects, flowers, and small wildlife, marvelling at how life persisted after the harshest winter. Henry maintained his detailed log, capturing the gradual return of life with both sketches and notes. His observations of animals, weather, soil, and human activity had evolved into a comprehensive chronicle of resilience and renewal. The broader community had similarly adapted. Neighbours helped each other repair homes, clean fields, and prepare for planting. Towns and villages, once isolated by snow and frozen roads, now communicated freely. Children played outdoors, exploring mud puddles, flowering meadows, and the soft, thawed terrain. Adults worked with caution, mindful of lingering hazards like unstable banks or waterlogged fields, yet approached each task with renewed optimism. The rivers, once feared for their treacherous ice and sudden flooding, now offered a sense of continuity and calm. Water flowed steadily, carrying remnants of winter debris downstream. Along the banks, early flowers swayed gently in the breeze, and small animals cautiously emerged from the shelter of frozen or snow-covered areas. Observing these changes, Thomas often reminded Henry of nature's patience and resilience. Even the strongest winter cannot stop life indefinitely. It only waits quietly until the time is right. Evenings at the Ramsay home were peaceful and reflective. After completing their daily chores, the family gathered near the stove or by the windows, observing the changing landscape and sharing stories. Eleanor recounted earlier springs and historical accounts, blending lessons in resilience, patience, and observation with family memories. Thomas emphasized humility and care, reminding his children that survival depended on both vigilance and respect for the natural world. Henry and Alice listened attentively, their imaginations enriched by tales of endurance, renewal, and human connection. The family often reflected on the winter of 1936, recognizing that it had tested not only physical strength but also patience, adaptability, and the capacity for empathy. The hardships of record-breaking cold, snowdrifts, frozen rivers, and isolation had been severe, yet they had revealed a deeper understanding of community, resourcefulness, and human resilience. One tranquil evening, as the sun cast long golden rays across the river, the family stepped outside together. Birds darted through the air, flowers bloomed along the banks, and the gentle murmur of the river provided a soothing backdrop. Alice pointed excitedly to a patch of blue and yellow flowers, whispering, "Look, life is everywhere." Thomas rested a hand on her shoulder and smiled. "Yes, Alice, even after the coldest winters, life always finds a way, and we've been fortunate to witness it returning." Henry sketched the scene carefully, capturing the river, flowers, birds, and the glow of sunset. His log had evolved into a record of endurance, hope, and the subtle rhythms of nature, an archive of one of the most extraordinary winters in US history and the resilience it inspired. As night fell, the family returned indoors, tucking themselves under quilts. The house, once chilled by winter winds and frozen windows, now held the comforting warmth of the stove and the fading sunlight. Outside, the river continued its gentle flow. The wind whispered through budding trees, and the chorus of returning wildlife filled the air. The memory of winter remained, but it was now infused with gratitude, hope, and quiet wonder. The winter of 1936, once remembered solely for its severity and record-breaking cold, had become a story of resilience, community, and renewal. Families who had endured isolation and hardship discovered their capacity for patience and resourcefulness. Children learned to observe and adapt. Communities formed stronger bonds, and across the land life persisted, quiet, patient, and unstoppable. For the Ramsays, the thawed landscape was both literal and symbolic, a testament to survival, the enduring rhythms of nature, and the beauty of life continuing even after extraordinary adversity. As they drifted into sleep, the soft sounds of the river, the rustling of trees, and the distant calls of wildlife carried them into dreams filled with hope and calm. A gentle reminder that even the harshest winters give way to renewal. If you have enjoyed this relaxing journey through history, please leave a comment below telling us where in the world you're listening to this story and what time it is. Don't forget to subscribe to Historical Truth so you can return for more stories like this in the future.